All right, all yours, John.
Thank you, Frank, and welcome to everybody, particularly our overseas visitors who are joining us tonight. We've got 9 presenters, which is a fairly full program. So I think the sooner we kick it off and keep things moving, the better. And the first one is marked 0. If you could go on to the first slide. Thank you, Frank. If you keep going, that's the batting order we've got. Mark is currently overseas, but he submitted his presentation before, of which this is the first slide. So I have to do the best I could because I didn't have a chance to discuss them with him. The first slide has 2 completely separate items, and the first of them is actually not too easy in terms of instructional marking to make a comment on. But the manuscript there is which it's hard to see in the blue pen halfway down the card. Please treat as letter with tuppenny halfpenny postage. And this was a reply card which has a penny on both sides. He's crossed out the reply side, added a halfpenny stamp, and has submitted it to go to Germany on the basis of the tuppence halfpenny rate. When it got there, I don't think they liked it because I think the blue 5 is an indication of some postage due payable in Germany. But it was a valiant attempt. And by the way, as Frank says, that there will be people here tonight who will know better than I on many of these issues. So if you could just keep the input towards the end and
Yeah, no
correct
worries.
any of my errors, that would be good. The second card there is going from Melbourne to Sydney. I can't quite get the sequence of dates here because the first cancel in Melbourne is the 7th. Then it has one of the 9th, but the Sydney is noon on the 10th, which is on the reverse. The key instructional mark is no address. It was addressed to Pitt Street, which anyone who knows Sydney is quite a large street, and to find a location on that street would not be straightforward. And it was eventually returned, but the date sequence doesn't seem to quite add up. But 2 interesting bits and anyone who knows Mark knows his particular interest is in postal stationery. So 2 examples from his collection of postal stationery. The next slide, thank you. This one I found quite a mystery. I'm pretty sure it's very clearly is a wrapper. Mark seemed to believe that it exceeded the 8 ounces and therefore the penny, and I can't quite work the date out on it. And someone has then added all, and I think the C post is in a different writing. But the implication is that it's going by the all C route by P&O. Bearing in mind the date and the likely sequence, I'm not quite sure what the alternative C was, but I'm just interested that it's been added, the all has been added, and is going totally by the P&O system, which may be a slower route, I don't know, but I'm sure someone observing tonight will be able to answer that question from WA to London. On the second side then is a card going from Geelong to Mount Gambier, and good to see Bob Hillman has joined us, who's now a resident of Mount Gambier. Had a penny on it, got to Hamilton, and they said, hang on a minute, that's not enough to get it interstate. So went back to Melbourne, a penny, a stamp was added, and then went back to Hamilton on its way to Mount Gambier. I can't quite work out. It seems to be it's either Gambier Town, but Bob Hillman may be able to put us out of our misery. But the arrival mark looks like Gambier Town rather than Mount Gambier. And there's a dead letter office mark, I'm pretty sure, on the bottom of the reverse. But a different, interesting card where it returned to sender for the additional penny. The next slide, thank you, Frank, is really something addressed, a card addressed to Bairnsdale, not known at Bairnsdale, returned, then goes to Bruthen, but my pronunciation but not good, Bruthen, missent to Tambo Crossing, and eventually gets back to the sender. But with a whole array of marks, including the dead letter office in Melbourne. But a very interesting range of missent markings and date stamps on the reverse. Thank you, Frank. This is another one that's had quite a journey. Originally from Melbourne, and destined to go to Matupi Island, but more interestingly to a German man of war. This is 1896, and the instructional mark is via Singapore. It did go to Singapore, but it eventually came back from Singapore and ended up on other islands in the Indonesian archipelago, but didn't ever get to Matupi Island. Interesting range of marks. It was going to a gunboat of the Imperial German Navy, which at some stage was involved in German New Guinea, which of course is the where Matupi Island is close by. Okay, Frank, well, let's move on to the next of the slides. This is something that I found fascinating. It's a pity that Richard Brecken isn't with us, but the interesting idea is that if someone sent a registered item and it got beyond its first post office to another post office, and they said, hang on a minute, there's not enough postage on all of this. It was a card went back to the originating post office saying underpaid. The clerk who was responsible for this had to pay it out of his own money, apparently, put stamps on a card, and pay the shortfall. The little blue mark, or not the rectangular blue mark, reads debit docket RB issued at Sydney with initials alongside, consistent with the regulation. And it's paying 2 shillings and 4pence. So I really don't know what the registered item was. It's very hard to actually tell, but an interesting idea. And I think the dates are on the 1950s, 1955, I think, that such a system where a clerk had to make up the shortfall was involved. And why it had actually a registered label on this card, which is really just paying the shortfall, I do not know, but a very interesting example. So that really completes Mark, and Mark is traveling somewhere overseas, and I don't imagine.
He's in Alaska at the moment.
He's in Alaska, is he? Well, I don't think he's joining in because he could have corrected my multiplicity of errors. But I thank him for contributing, and I now call on Graham Hayward to start his presentation. Thank you, Graham.
Thanks, John. Yeah, well, my instructional marks, as you know, a lot of them consist of too lates and things, so I thought I'd avoid too late tonight and try and pick out some other different ones. The first one's a nature of a letter, which isn't a hand stamp, it's actually a manuscript nature of a letter, but this is the insert card for the Jubilee envelope. The envelope had postage on it, but the insert card had no postage on it. And somebody's tried to use this card as if it was a postcard by adding a adhesive stamp to it. So it's been pulled up as being in the nature of a letter. Is caught out on two things really, because you couldn't send a postcard with an adhesive stamp before 1894. You had to use the pre-printed postal stationery for a postcard. So it would have been rejected on that grounds. But also, although it's interesting, the only writing on it is in what looks like Pitman's shorthand or something on the back. You can see a bit of it there on the extract I've shown. So he didn't have any chance of this getting accepted as a postcard. The inspector's stamps, those little circular double circle marks, are quite common in this era, and they usually the inspectors get involved when there's something to do with rates, very often on overseas items, and it's not uncommon to have a lot of those marks on one cover. So there's two on this one. Sometimes you get 2, 3, or even more of those marks, all different on different dates. Okay, thanks, John. Thanks, Frank. Right, now I've got sent back to England without a reason for non-delivery. This is a letter to New South Wales. It appears to be from a fellow trying to contact his brother about his inheritance or leaving something to him, but obviously Sydney had a bigger population in those days than just finding somebody just like that with Sydney. and no street or anything. So we hope that eventually he might have caught up with him and given him his money. But the interesting thing on this is that no, actually, I was going to make a comment which relates to another thing. Yeah, so it's. I think that's all I need to say on that one. We'll go on, Frank. Now, this is another sent back to England, really, for it shows virtually the same thing, but many years later. So the wording's changed slightly, but they're still sending something back. I think the reason why this was sent back is really quite obvious. It was an airmail flight cover that's gone to a post restaurant, and obviously, or to the postmaster, and obviously the sender wanted it sent back as a philatelic item, but he wouldn't have actually gone to collect it, I wouldn't think. And this was going on the first North Atlantic email in 1939. Okay, thanks, Frank. Another flight one, but back in the early days of the 1920s, when they were doing the flights to France, very often the weather interfered, so there was no flight. This one actually has ended up getting almost a mini French lesson all over it, because the addressee is, it says there, if you can't, the addressee isn't known, please send it back. And it's picked up the relevant marks to be sent back, but it's also picked up not only the no flight cover a mark, but also the return to the sender from the French post office. So we've got a couple of instructional marks on that one. Thank you, Frank. And this is another email one, but going to Shanghai, but not sufficiently paid. The correct rate, it's got tuppence halfpenny plus sixpence. It should have been tuppence halfpenny plus tenpence. Interestingly, though, this was apparently posted too early, because according to Newell, the first flight should have been a month later. So perhaps they got mixed up with months there on catching the first flight. Okay, thank you, Frank. And this one, I like this, of course, because it ended up in Sutton Coldfield. It was addressed to Sutton Coldfield, my hometown, but it was buried in France or detained in France during the German occupation. So the extract from the newspaper details actually another cover. So obviously there was a batch of mail. The other cover had exactly the same dates as this particular one. So obviously a batch of mail was held and eventually all posted at the same time to England. And when it got to Sutton, of course, it's been readdressed to Kenilworth in Warwickshire. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Graham. Now we call on one of our international guests, who's particularly welcome to join us. Brian, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So first slide, please. Yeah, detained on board ship. You'll have seen various articles about this. They were used, these cancellations, these marks were used at Melbourne and Sydney. There are 16 examples recorded from Melbourne and 5 from Sydney. The problem is that with the descriptions in the auction catalogues from the 1940s and 50s, it's not possible to clearly attribute to a particular example. So there may be some duplication. So there's a maximum of 16 of the Melbourne mark, of which I know Ian Gregg has one, and probably Gary has one as well. And as you probably know, the cachet was used to remove blame from the post office, nothing to do with fumigation. Next slide, please. This is the Sydney equivalent, of which there are 4 definite examples recorded. Interestingly, Gary Diffin has 1. I've got 2. Jeff Amos has 1. So I think that's the lot. There are a couple in archives. I don't count those, as I'm assuming they'll remain in archives. Although I know that certain items have been removed from archives and in some cases destroyed. So the South Australia, it left in April of 54. It arrived on the 7th of May, but the mail wasn't delivered to the post office until the following day. That was the reason for the cachet. Next one, please. This is an advertised mark, which Gary Diffin tells me is fairly scarce. I know of one other December, DE, and one SE, September. I know Gary has one example because he's shown me. There's another one in the UK, and this is the 3rd. There must be others, but I've never seen them. So if anyone knows of them, I'd be delighted to hear. The addressee was not found, so it was advertised in the South Australian Register on the 12th of January. This was a practice that all the states used, was to advertise unclaimed letters, and Mr. J.E. Dyerson can be seen on the 4th line down of that advertisement. So yes, nothing else to say really. It's from Cape Town, prepaid and charged at the incoming rate of 6p. Next one, please. Well, I have got a too late item. The too late mark was in use, this particular one was in use for at least 26 years, from 1838 to 64. The free mark was in use from March 43 to May 48. Nothing else to say about that, so let's move to the next one, please. Another advertised. Once again, the addressee couldn't be located. Another, a second interesting address, Mr. John Crook, Sydney or elsewhere, bracket to be left at the post office there to be forwarded, if not there, bracket New South Wales. So we have, we've previously had one that was even more obscure, but obviously he didn't claim. So once again, in the next month's Government Gazette on the 1st of August, John Crook can be seen being the 4th name down in the right-hand column. And it was charged on receipt, but there's nobody to pay, obviously. And the manuscript advertised in red as usual. Okay, next one, please. The final one is the via markings and midday mail. Midday mail being applied to mail which was received too late for the first delivery, and therefore the second was sent by the second mail, starting at 1 o'clock, between Sydney and Parramatta only. What's interesting is that it's a terrible strike of the Via Casellas, but I've not seen another, and White didn't record it. So 16 offices have been recorded with Via markings. I'm sure Gary's got one or two. Stephen Brown's got several, and that's the only one I've got, because in theory, I don't collect New South Wales anymore. I just happen to have quite a bit left over. Possum Jack, the bushranger, was referred to in the letter, and the writer examined the body and was reporting to Patrick Leslie at a farm at Coleroy. Interesting character, Leslie. It was his management of his uncle's farm was a disaster. It was repossessed by his uncle. He moved to Queensland, was the first to settle on the Darling Downs, and eventually moved back to the UK. That's it. Thank you very much.
Brian, thank you very much indeed. Excellent, and as ever, a very variable array. Thank you for that. John Wilkins next, if John is ready, please.
Yes. What I've done is that I've got 6 items that I've taken from between 1897 and 1933. This first one that you see has it's a line cancel on the postal stationery, the 10-cent postal stationery, and the series of people where they were handed from one to the other. That this line this would be a local person who had collected mail and put his own stamp on it, and there's several of these throughout the Netherlands East Indies. But the mere fact that you've got 4 or 5 sort of one after the other, and all I can think of is that they obviously, because of the date, there's no aeroplanes and there's no cars, so it must be either by horse, or it's possible in the 1890s that they had introduced bicycles into Java, so that's a possibility as well. But it's an interesting one with all the postmarks. So that's where we finish with that. The next, please. Yes, now that one is an East Java post office, Rowan, and it has a postal stationery item which had been further overprinted with a 10-cent in black, and then there are 2.5-cent stamps to make up the mail cost for that particular letter. It's interesting. The letters going from Java to Holland, and it would be by shipping. And it's interesting to note that the ship would, if it took an average of 10 knots for over 31 days, which is a 5,500 nautical mile route through the Suez Canal, this seems to fit in with the dating on the letter. But it's an interesting one about the way that developed. Thank you. Next. Now this one is an unusual one. Somebody, I think, in the east end of Java, probably near Surabaya, lodged this letter without any franking on it. And this was in the middle of December 1915. And they must have had some concerns, but anyhow, it got a census mark on it. Mind you, whilst it's 1915 and Holland was one of the neutral nations in Europe, but this letter was only within Java itself. It went from East Java to West Java. It went to the Suabang in the west, which is closer to Batavia. And when they got there at Suabang, they realised it was unable to be sent, so they crossed it out and put another one, sending it back in red to Surabaya. Now, the interesting thing is it took a month for the letter to get from Surabaya to Suabang, and at Suabang they hung on to it quickly, and on the same day they sent it to Veltervraden, where they forwarded it for mail back to Surabaya. Now, the interesting thing on this particular occasion, it took them 2 days to get it back to Surabaya. And I must admit, not having anything in the way, I think probably motor vehicles are pretty scarce in those days. And it's 600 miles between each of those places, between Batavia and Surabaya, 600 miles. So the only thing I could think of, they must have had a mail ship that was doing 20 knots for them to be able to do that. So I couldn't think of any other way of doing it unless they had someone that got a car, an early model car, and was able to drive it down over 2 days. So that's where that one, a very unusual one, but they put the back when they got to Surabaya, they put the 10 and 15 cent postage dues on it to pay virtually, as far as I could see, almost like 7.5 cents one way, 7.5 cents the other. So that's how it works out. Next. Now, this is an unusual one. Whilst it doesn't involve postmarks, it involves the most unusual procedure by the Dutch government. They were obviously having, by 1921, problems with ships sinking en route and back from the Netherlands East Indies, and such that somebody came up with a good idea that they would design a container and it would be fitted out to be a safe container for mail. And then they produced 7 stamps, which are shown there, which is like a mail insurance situation. And they opened it up in 1921, and they closed it down in 1923 as it was an experiment which they must have found difficult. But the idea is that safe arrangement, which you see, is courtesy of the Chigasha Daily Express from the Oklahoma Indian Territory in the USA, 1921. I was fortunate to get hold of a copy of that, the only one that was ever seen that I've been able to find, showing you what it looked like, as I say. And when the ship sank, that would float off, and alarms and bells and hoots and whistles and all sorts of things went on while it floated around until they eventually realised the ship was lost, and they sent out somebody to rescue that and get the mail. So it's there, but these items, there were only about 5,200 stamps used during that 2.5-year period. And when they got to 1923 and they decided to stop it, the stamps were made invalid for postage and the whole thing was closed. Now, probably because the Dutch were starting to develop their airlines, and they probably could see the writing on the wall that airlines were going to be something that they were going to bring in. Thank you. Next. Now, this one is an interesting one. We've got an air letter here, and it is special cancel. It's from Padang, which is up on the northwest coast of Sumatra. Now, the system here worked this way, that they would offer through this particular thing on the postmark, you see, sent via a radio, which means sent by radio. So what it did is that the contents of the letter would be sent by radio, probably over to Singapore, where it would then be put on landline or underground cable and sent to the destination in Holland. In the meanwhile, the post office back in Sumatra would send this by mail, this time by airmail, back to Holland, so that the person who had got his message via the cable, the radio, would receive the actual letters, make sure that there was a check on what was being sent, so that it verified one with the other. It's an interesting one, but it's one that they used on many occasions. Next.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, Nat, went too far.
Just one left.
One left.
Just one left. Hang on. This one here is a 1931. The Dutch in Netherlands East Indies organised for their international mail service to now go from Batavia to Sydney as the first. So they opened up that new stamp, the blue stamp, on the cover. The difficulty is the two postmarks for the associated letter rate were earlier, and it gives the appearance that the cover was given to the first postmark office, and it added the one gulden new stamp, but did not postmark it. It then got transferred to Batavia, where at Batavia they appeared to have the hand stamp, because then you've got Abel Tasman and then Surabaya in the triangular postmark. Very interesting. I've seen 2 or 3 of these, and they all do the same thing. If it was going internationally, only the main post office would have that hand stamp, triangular hand stamp, with that stamp, and it was placed by the main post office. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And now we call upon another John Mackay. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Something rather different. All of my 6 examples are military mail from Sweden, and they're illustrating the use and development of 2 different kinds of markings. The first one is shown here on a letter from March 1808, sent from the military headquarters in Åland. And now, those of you who may not know, Åland is a number of islands that sit in a very strategic position in the Baltic Sea, halfway between Finland and Sweden. From the 14th century, they were part of Sweden, as was Finland. But in 1808, during the Napoleonic Wars, Russia launched an attack on Finland and eventually was able to defeat the Swedes and take Finland as a Grand Duchy. It was a Grand Duchy from 1809 until the Russian Revolution in 1917, when Finland declared independence. So the first 2 letters are of considerable historical interest. From 1808, when the Russians were attacking Swedish forces in Finland, what has been known as the Finnish War of 1808. And I don't want to spend too much time on the history. I know we're talking about the markings. If any of you are interested in the history of these letters, and I think they are of considerable interest, I've written a series of articles around these letters that have been published in Scandinavian Contact, which is the journal of the Scandinavian Philatelic Society. And if anyone would like a copy of these articles, I'd be more than happy to circulate them if you just let me know. The other interest, before we go on to this first example, is that it's almost certain, someone mentioned earlier about items disappearing from archives. It's almost certain that these items were all stolen. The first 4 letters anyway, were stolen from the Finnish archives in Turku. And that's a story in itself. I'm assured that my ownership of these covers is not in any doubt. But again, my articles in Scandinavian Contact cover the question of the items being stolen. So let me go on to the instructional markings and leave behind most of the history. This letter was sent to a local, I guess you call him a bailiff or a sheriff sheriff, his name was Malander. The Russians were attacking, and the letter tells him that he must go around all the farms in Åland and try to persuade the farmers to stay on their land. If the Russians land in Åland, they should stay on their land, because if they flee, it will make it much worse. The letter's interesting then because of this marking on the left, the squiggle. The squiggle, in fact, is a hand-drawn version of a royal crown. This was something that was used in Swedish mail from around about the middle of the 17th century to indicate that this was on government, or rather royal business. This was a letter on royal business and therefore was not charged any postage. So you have this stylized crown, which is very common in the mail from this time to indicate government or royal mail. Next one, please. The second one is slightly later, from September 1808. The Swedes made a last-ditch attack on the Russian forces at the Battle of Helsinki Village. And this letter relates to, after the Swedish defeat by the Russian forces there, this relates to the safe passage of the Swedish commander, Baron Boise, who was retreating from Finland via Åland. And again, a letter of considerable historical interest. But what I want to show you here is something that in the early part of the 19th century indicated the importance of a letter and the speed with which it was delivered. This is what is called a Swedish feather letter. You may see at the very top there a white feather attached to a red wax seal. And this was the equivalent of a airmail sticker. It meant that the letter had to fly like a bird and be delivered as quickly as possible. Now, I've got another example in a minute, which will show you that the number of feathers that were attached to these feather letters, and also the colors of the feather, indicated just how important the letter was. Now, this letter seemed to me, having with my colleagues from the Åland Philatelic Society translated this letter, it seems to me to be a rather urgent letter about looking after the commander of the Swedish forces. But this is only one feather, and it's a white feather. Now, the white feather is generally indicating that it will only travel during the day. And if it's really urgent, as you'll see in a minute, it also had a black feather, which indicated that it should be traveling by night as well. So the Swedes were defeated and had to sign a peace treaty of Fredericksburg in 1809, and Finland became part of Russia. At the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Treaty of Vienna in 1815, Sweden was compensated by being given Norway as a consolation prize. It's what happened at the Treaty of Vienna. And so, next one, please, Frank. The next one is, in fact, a little bit after the Russians have taken over, but really indicates that nothing has changed. This is a letter that is following very much the Swedish model. It's written in Swedish, and to this day, even though Åland is still part of Finland, almost all of the population of Åland speaks Swedish, and the Åland has been granted a sort of semi-autonomous status within Finland. So this is after the time of the Russian takeover in Finland, but is very much a Swedish kind of letter. And at the bottom left-hand corner, you will see another example of one of these hand-drawn crowns, which indicate that this is a royal or government letter. Next one, please. And here you see a rather fine feather letter. Feather letters were introduced at around 1750 and lasted close to 1850, although they become rarer after around 1830. And at the top of this letter, you will see two feathers, indicating that this is of considerable urgency, and that one of the feathers is black, which indicates, as I said earlier, that it needs to be delivered, even if it means riding the horse overnight to deliver it. Again, notice the crown. There's quite a lot of studies of different kinds of crown. This is a triple, what's called a triple scroll. The one that was on earlier had a more like a quadruple scroll, and part of Swedish government mail studies, it relates to the precise design of these scrolled crowns, which indicate royal postage. Next one, please, Frank. We're now only a little bit later, but by now the stylized crowns have been replaced by markings which indicate again that this is government mail. In the bottom left-hand corner, you will see there F, if you can read those letters, FRBR, which in Swedish is fri brev, free letter, which means that it is on government business and therefore doesn't need to be charged any mail. Now, this is also military mail. After the defeat of the Swedes by the Russians in 1809, there was a considerable reorganization of the Swedish military, and right to the very top, the Swedish king at the time had no heir, was not even married, and was about to die. And the establishment in Sweden panicked and went to the court of Napoleon and persuaded one of the marshals from Napoleon's French army to come to Sweden and be declared the heir to the throne. And Count Bernadotte was his name, and he eventually became a king and changed his name to a suitably Swedish sounding name, and reorganized the army. And this involved a good deal of military exercises, and this and the next letter are both from military exercises, which became a huge part of Sweden's military activities in the early part of the 19th century, as Sweden attempted to make its army more effective. Next one, please, Frank. And here you see this is one that I'm particularly proud of. It's a rather good example of military mail from the 1830s. Again, I won't bother you with the history of exactly what's going on, but again, notice in the bottom left-hand corner, free letter, free brev, indicating that no postage is to be paid. Now, this you could just write free brev on a letter and get away with no postage, and obviously that was open to all kinds of abuse. And eventually the Swedish government decided they were losing too much money because every Tom, Dick and Harry was writing free brev on their letters. And in 1874, the first official stamps were issued by Sweden. And from then on, all of this free brev stuff, eventually, later on in the 19th century, you get stamps which say free brev, and stamps. But by 1874, all of this had been replaced by the official stamps, which presumably the government could keep control of much more easily. Thank you. That's all.
John, thank you very much. And that fascinating display. Thank you. Kevin Burt, next, please.
Oh, hi, Frank and all. Most interesting proceedings. My collection is all registered mail, and by its very nature, it tends to travel a very strict regulated path between the sender and the addressee. But it's an imperfect world, and sometimes things do go astray. Thanks, Frank. Here's one, a nice kangaroo cover from Oxford Street in Sydney, and obviously was considered to have been containing coin, and was irregularly posted. So it was sent back to the dead letter office, and where on the reverse it has the dead letter office CDS of the 26th of April 1913. And the reg label is one of the early New South Wales labels, of which there are quite a different number of varieties. Very interesting. Thanks, Frank. Now this one is quite interesting because for a number of reasons. Deficient postage notice at the top, but there was no postage due stamps attached to the mail, so I presume it got to Malcolm Reid and Company in Rundle Street without any problem for a penny. And the postmistress at the time, Miss Raw, R-A-W-E, according to Martin Walker's book. And she was obviously had a foot in both camps, because the old system was a registered hand stamp with the number inserted as it is, 147. And then she decided, oh, well, maybe she should be investigating these newfangled registration labels. And she's done the 147 on that as well, just to be absolutely sure. So it's quite an interesting cover. Thanks, Frank. The Perth Titles Office is a source of a great deal of mail which went astray. I have at least 35 different items in my collection with different reg labels on them, with all unclaimed and missent and unknown by letter carrier, and all sorts of. And this one has been registered twice, both in Perth, once going and once coming. So it's quite an interesting example. And the label type W5A beneath a W12A, which would be knowledge of registration label collectors. But it's a very interesting cover. Thank you, Frank. This is another Titles Office, Perth Titles Office. And I said, well, it's got hand stamps on it, and certainly quite literally hand stamps, return to sender, because the coal merchant, if you can read through the hand stamps, the coal merchant in Annandale in Sydney was not to be found, and was left the address and handwritten unclaimed. It was returned to the Perth Titles Office from the Sydney Dead Letter Office on the 13th of March 1920. Thanks, Frank. Now, this is probably my favourite cover. Right down on the bottom left, there's posted in slips, and I think that means that it was simply posted in the street box in Geelong. And being a registered letter, of course, that wouldn't earn any brownie points. So they decided to register it anyway. And of course, it was deficient by a penny, and it got the tuppenny postage due stamp on it as well, and the tax marking. The added joy for me on this cover is the reg label is an exceedingly rare one. But that's another matter. Thanks, Frank. Okay, unclaimed. Obviously, Mr. Gosley in Pomona had left his address, but they were still expected an avis de reception, acknowledgement of receipt, and that didn't happen. Cooroy, by the way, is in the general vicinity of Gympie, so it was returned also via the Brisbane Dead Letter Office. Thanks, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
That's it for me.
Okay, over to David Bradley, please.
Thank you very much. These are all examples of commercial airmail between 1932 and 35 from Mozambique Company in Portuguese East Africa to various destinations elsewhere. Could I have the first slide, please? In the first instance, there was no agreement for carriage of airmail by Imperial Airways, and so the airmail had to be posted in Mozambique Company and paid in full in Mozambique. And then when it reached Salisbury by train, an overnight train, it would be additionally paid the full airmail postage in Southern Rhodesian stamps. The original sender had written airmail. The post office in Salisbury added a standard Rhodesian airmail label. So this is an example of double postage because there was no agreement between, as I say, the beginning of airmail in March 1932 and the 15th of August 1932. So could I have the second slide, please? On the 16th of August, they introduced a new regulation whereby they would have this, as you can see, small blue label that says airmail, and it says affranchissement perçu, which is postage paid, and it has in handwritten manuscript francs 137. Now, you might wonder, why is a postage system in Portuguese East Africa levying postage in francs? Well, this was the UPU system of gold francs. And at this time, each Portuguese escudo was approximately 16 cents in French gold francs. So they printed these labels in 1932. As you can see, they printed, look at the bottom, 20,000 of them, but somebody made a mistake. They printed the wrong number. The number of the regulation for airmail was M13, but they printed them with MCB, which was the regulation for registration. Now, if you look at the registration label at the left, you can see that that correctly has, reading up at the left, M6B, 1931. So that's a registration label printed in 1931 for regulation M6B for registration, 40,000 of them. Okay, so what they did between mid-August 1933 and the end of 1933 was they wrote in red, in ink, over the 6B, the correct number 13. What we see here is a cover which went by airmail registered. The registration rate at this time was 80 cents. Postage also 1 escudo 40, so 220 is correct. The airmail from Beira to London at this time for between 1 and 20 grams was assessed at 1 franc 39. Multiply that by 6 to get a price in escudos. So they paid quite a bit of money for this. Now, could I have the second slide? Eventually, they got tired of putting the 13s on these labels. And then from early 1934 until 11th January 1935, they just used them as they came. And as you can see, it still has the airmail surcharge written in ink on the label, 116. It still has the registration label on the left. Notice it's about 1,200 numbers later than the previous letter, which was about 8 months before. So there's quite a lot of this registered mail going. And there's another thing you see down at the lower left here, you see 8 grams, 116. According to the regulation, the post office official was meant to write the weight of the letter, 8 grams, and the assessable airmail surcharge. In this case, the airmail surcharge from Mozambique to Italy was less than the surcharge rate from Mozambique to England. Those paid 116. So could I have the third slide, please? So again, they changed the rules in early January 1935. They cancelled this strange arrangement where you had some of the postage, which was eventually paid to Imperial Airways, written in ink on a little blue label. And they started to use these same little blue labels just as ML instructional labels. So here's a cover that traveled from Beira to Singapore. And of course, all this mail went from Beira to Salisbury and Southern Rhodesia by the overnight train, and then typically took the Imperial Airways northbound flight the next day. So this one got a fair run for its money. It went from Beira to Salisbury by train. Then it went by Imperial Airways, as it happens, in 204 from Salisbury to Alexandria or Cairo, then by train to Alexandria, and then Imperial Airways eastbound service going from Alexandria to, in this case, Singapore. And as you can see, the sender has written on the top, by air to Singapore. At that time, there was no service by air from Singapore to Hong Kong, so it then went by ship. And what had to happen then, because it was not traveling by airmail anymore, we put a jusqu'à marking, up to marking. These are typically two lines across the airmail label. This happens to be the Singapore jusqu'à marking, which is a barrel-shaped thing, crossing out the airmail. Now, the other interesting thing about this label is they've perforated off the bit that has the place where you would write the money, but they've done it with the perforating machine that they also had used to produce the labels. So the same person that made these labels in 1932 and put the wrong number on them was also employed in January 1935 to perforate them in half so that they could be used. And these labels continued to be used for approximately 6 months. The very last use that I can attest is actually a philatelic use, so I won't show that. But what then happened, and this, could I have the last slide? They printed some neutral ML labels that did not indicate that that any postage has been paid, but they're on the same paper with the same perforation and with similar size, although the type is different. And again, it says IML in Portuguese and French. And here again, the letter has gone from Beira to Salisbury, then by Imperial Airways, probably AN 248 to Croydon, and then by train to Glasgow. And in this case, as you can see, they have the normal CDS of 17 June 1935. So from the time when they ran out of those old labels, 20,000 labels printed in 1932, they eventually had to print another lot in 1935. So 3.5 years nearly, 3 years of using the same label for effectively a number of different purposes. First as an air surcharge label, then as a airmail instructional label, and then finally replaced by this definitive airmail instructional label. So that's all I have to say. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Graham Plaw next, please.
Thank you, John. Rather than have another example of postal rates, I've taken a slightly light-hearted look at the whole subject of instructional markings and looked at various post office markings that appeared on some of my material. First slide, please, Frank. For example, here's a letter that went from Melbourne to USA, just to the manager of the Philadelphia Bank in without an address, just simply Philadelphia. And it has a marking by the Postal Service over there in Chicago saying that the address was incomplete, and therefore they completed it there on site because they knew where it was and gave the note accordingly. But more interestingly, down the bottom is a hand stamp that said, supposed to contain matter subject to the provision of Executive Order 8389 as amended. And I checked through this and found that Franklin Delano Roosevelt in April of 1940 had passed an executive order that all transit of credit and notes and exchanges between banks all had to go through this executive order or pass by this executive order. So it was rather an interesting item that contained some form of association with cash. Now, the next slide, Frank, is an Australian example where it went from this time was, excuse me a sec, I'm looking at an iPad, which is very difficult to read, so I'm looking at my screen. It goes from Morwell to East Brighton, and it's a registered cover. And this one has got that same marking on the top, hand stamped, officially registered, supposed to contain coin. So it obviously allowed the coin to go through the service. And of course, you weren't supposed to do that unless you had been given approval to do so. But that was another interesting example. As you noted, also was underpaid and had to pay a 6p tax, which was noted accordingly on the left-hand corner. Thanks, Frank. The next one. Now, this is very much a philatelic item, but I thought it was interesting, an oddity that we've all seen before. It's come from a philatelic auction in South Africa to Australia, and it was damaged by water beyond control of Australia Post. Now, they didn't want to have responsibility for the fact that this was a terribly marked item and it was all wet and destroyed, and so they gave an official notice to say, it's not our fault. And I thought that was a lot of fun to see that one. Terrible envelope, nothing special about it. It simply had a postage paid non-stamp, but an envelope with a postage paid marking on it, and then the additional postage for sending it to Australia. Next. This is one that ended up in my post office box here in 2011. And the post office told me that it arrived in this condition at the local post office in this form. And I thought it was rather nice of them to give me an envelope because there was nothing inside and there was no return address on the back of it provided by whoever sent it to me. So if anybody out there was sent it to me, perhaps they could tell me what it was all about because I know nothing. Next one. This was a commercial cover that left the publishing company in London, but they forgot to, or decided not to put a stamp on it. Royal Mail noticed this, added a hand stamp to pay, posted, unpaid. And the 4p was paid. I'm not sure who would have paid that 4p, but it was paid. A postage due stamp was applied accordingly, and the mail obviously reached its destination. That destination is unknown to me because, as you can see, it doesn't have an address inside it to tell me where it came through, but I've got that in my collection anyway. And finally, just another fun thing was an airmail postcard from Canada that came to a couple of doors up the road from where I used to live, and the neighbour gave me this postcard from Quebec, and it's got quality of service check to the delivery officer. Please carefully detach this label and hand to the officer in charge. Now, obviously they were doing a check on whether the mail got through on time or properly, and the post officer was supposed to tell the officials that it occurred, but he never sent it back. Therefore, Australia Post records are incomplete because I've still got the little label on it that shouldn't be on the envelope or shouldn't be on the postcard.
Very good.
So that's it. That's the lot, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Graham. And last but by no means least, Alan Shatton. Please, Alan.
Thank you, John. First slide, please. So, posted out of course in Tasmania was used if a letter had been posted in the wrong letterbox. There were 3 versions, 2 from Hobart, 1 from Launceston, and this Launceston version had a very long life, as you can see, but examples are not that common. I understand that in Great Britain, the use of this hand stamp was slightly different. I believe that there it was applied if an article had been posted in a postbox rather than being processed at the counter, for example, a registered article. Next slide, please, Frank. I've got 4 Tasmanian examples for the Great Independent Stamp of Tasmania, and then I'll finish with a big finish of 2 local examples. This is a very busy envelope. It shows cannot be found on the lower left and return to sender in red near the centre of the envelope. The multi-box hand stamp on the right of the back has space for 16 postmen to enter their initials. A number of postmen might have tried to locate the addressee, and they would initial and date their efforts. I believe that only 6 or 7 examples of this box are in existence. The sequence of postal events was that it was posted at Beaconsfield on the 3rd of August. It arrived at Launceston on the 4th of August. And then Exeter, which is to the south of Launceston, on the 5th of August. Sidmouth, which is not quite as far south, on the 7th of August. Went back to Beaconsfield on the 7th of August. And the next stamp is for Beaconsfield on the 10th of September, Launceston on the 10th of September, and there's a dead letter office stamp with an unknown date, which would be after the 10th of September. So this letter really got around and I didn't find the addressee at all. Thanks, Frank. This is an example of the more to pay stamps. There's quite a few of them. This one, used in Hobart, encouraged the postal clerk to write the additional amount required. Other versions have pre-printed additional amounts, like 2p or 4p, but the largest amount ever written on this particular hand stamp was 6 and 3p. It was in use from 1892 to 1902, and it's quite scarce. Thanks, Frank. This is just a front. It's got 2 interesting features. I'm sorry I'm showing you a too late stamp, but this hand stamp was applied if the letter was posted beyond the last collection of the day for transmission to its destination. There was a stamp in use for a long time in Hobart, and for a long time a separate stamp in Launceston, but they're almost identical, and you have to look at the contents to pick the difference. There was a third in use on the West Coast. The second feature, which is not all that easy to see on the screen, although you can see it on the cover, is the large stamp of Hobart's General Post Office. This originally had the letters VDL between the day and month and the year of the date. Now, according to John Harding, who's the world expert on Tasmanian postmarks, VDL was excised in 1870, but this example is 1869, and there's no trace of the letters VDL at all. Tasmania, or Van Diemen's Land became Tasmania in 1855. It took them a while to do the excision, and there's a GPO Adelaide arrival mark on this example. That's the end of Tasmania. Thanks, Frank. Let's go to Victoria. This is a fickle finger and a very good example of the unclaimed box stamp. I believe that's what they're called. You can see all of the different options for an unclaimed box. It was used in Murrumbina. There's unknown by postman, no street number, insufficiently addressed, unknown at address, left address, refused, deceased, and a space for the round number and the date and initials of the postman. It's a nice example of that. But my big finish, thank you, Frank, is that I've got fickle fingers in two different colours, in red and in bluey green. And I think that's a fitting end to this exciting example of postal stationery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, as ever, going out with a bang as ever. Now, Frank, I don't know whether you've had a number of questions submitted through.
I had none, John. Only a comment by Gary Diffin, and I can't remember who that was for. It says Crook had probably relocated to Gippsland by 1840, so I think that's related to
Brian Peace.
Yeah.
That Crook correspondence came out of Gippsland, and it dates from about mid-1830s through to the 1840s. And in the 1830s, they were located in Sydney, but I think they went to Gippsland probably in 1840, 1841, somewhere around there. So that's why they probably couldn't find him.
Thanks, Gary.
The question about Gambierton that John raised. Mount Gambier originally opened in the 1840s, mainly as a postal town for overland mail to Melbourne. In 1862 to 1878, they changed its name to Gambierton. And there were three types of date stamps used in that period. But then there was a groundswell of dissent, and the name was changed back to Mount Gambier after 1878.
Thanks, Bob. Now, any other questions? Surely that wide variety of material, there must be some questions.
I was very sorry.
No, I was going to say, I think it's fascinating that if you wanted to post an express letter in Oland, you had to first catch a blackbird and a white dove and pinch the feathers.
I was going to make a similar.
Greg.
I was going to make a similar comment. I've never seen that before. I want to know, is that an early form of airmail?
Yeah.
It's a forerunner to email.
It was fascinating, though. Like Ian, it was a system I had no conception of.
Yeah. Can I just make a comment and a question, I guess? Someone asked about posted in slips. My understanding is that many post offices had like slots where you could drop mail, basically. And basically a lot of it was newspapers, I think. And I think those were the references to slips. And I think mail occasionally got misplaced in there, probably either by the post office or possibly by the senders. But I don't know if anyone knows any further information on that.
Again, a new expression to me.
There is a Victoria hand stamp that actually, or information stamp that actually says misplaced in slips. And I think if you look at it's on one of the items I did an article in Flashley from Australia about 3 or 4 months ago.
I'm sure that was what happened. It was simply, it being a registered letter, it was simply put in the street box incorrectly.
Anything else?
Well, Kevin commented on postage due not being charged on a registered letter. I think that's because the responsibility for the correct postage was placed on the postal clerk when it was handed in over the counter. And theoretically, postage due stamps on a registered letter should be impossible because the clerk who received the letter was responsible for the postage being correct.
Quite.
That was the theme of Mark's last display. That was an example of going back to that clerk and making him pay the deficit. Yeah. Now, if there's nothing else, let me just sort of say I think that it's been a wonderful, diverse array, as most of these showings are, and I'd like to thank on everyone's behalf everyone who has contributed this evening, and on top of which I'd like to thank everyone who's participated. I hope you've enjoyed your evening. The question that feedback is always welcome is, views about Zoom for postal history. Postal history has a complexity to it that may not lend itself to Zoom sessions, but I think tonight everyone has done a good job of keeping the commentary, quite short and to the point, and emphasising instructional markings. But one could go through great detail as to the passage of particular items, which doesn't really add value. But I think tonight it's been a particularly interesting and a very good display, and I thank everyone for either contributing and also for participating. So with that, Frank, I think unless there's anything, comments from the floor, we'll close and say thank you again.
John.
Thank you, everyone.
Very good.
Good night, all.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Night. Great
Good
to
night.
see everybody.
Good night.